19-1. That's the kill ratio the F6F Hellcat achieved against Japanese aircraft in World War II, destroying 19 enemy planes for every Hellcat lost in air combat. Think about what that means for a moment, because these weren't practice targets or obsolete biplanes. These were Japanese fighters flown by pilots who'd been trained since childhood to view dying for the Emperor as the highest honor imaginable. The Zero had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years, had destroyed American fighters with contemptuous ease, had created a reputation for invincibility that terrified Allied pilots who knew engaging a Zero meant probably dying. Then the Hellcat arrived in 1943, and everything changed overnight, turning Japanese air superiority into American turkey shoots, where experienced Zero pilots died by the hundreds while their replacements lasted mere hours in combat. By war's end, the Hellcat had destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft while losing just 270 in air combat, creating kill ratios that shouldn't be possible between professional militaries flying frontline equipment. This is the story of how American engineers studied every Zero weakness and built a fighter specifically designed to kill them. How American training created pilots who could exploit those advantages. How technological superiority and tactical doctrine combined to destroy Japanese naval aviation so completely that by 1945 they were reduced to kamikaze attacks because they'd run out of pilots capable of conventional combat. The Zero problem dominated American thinking in early Pacific War when Japanese fighters routinely outmaneuvered and outfought American aircraft that had seemed adequate in peacetime but proved dangerously inferior in combat. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a revelation when it appeared, lighter and more maneuverable than anything America flew, capable of outturning every Allied fighter while climbing faster and flying farther than designers thought possible. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages ruthlessly, baiting American fighters into turning dogfights where the Zero's superior agility meant certain victory, racking up kill ratios that ran heavily in Japan's favor during 1941 and 1942. American pilots learned to fear the Zero's distinctive profile and avoid dogfighting at all costs, developing hit-and-run tactics that worked sometimes but couldn't overcome fundamental performance disadvantages that made every engagement potentially fatal. The captured Zero in the Aleutians changed everything by giving American engineers their first intact example to study and test and understand. They discovered that Japanese designers had achieved performance through radical weight reduction, stripping out armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks and anything that added pounds, while using lightweight construction that made the Zero fragile when hit. This was brilliant engineering that created a fighter optimized for maneuverability and range, perfect for the kind of war Japan expected to fight, where pilot skill and aircraft agility would dominate. But it also revealed fatal vulnerabilities that Americans could exploit if they built a fighter designed specifically to counter Zero strengths while maximizing Zero weaknesses. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation got that assignment and delivered the F6F Hellcat, an aircraft that looked at the Zero problem and solved it through overwhelming technological advantages rather than trying to out-agile a more maneuverable opponent. The Hellcat design philosophy was simple but revolutionary for its time, prioritizing pilot survival and technological advantages over dogfighting capability. Grumman engineers armored everything, installing self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when hit, adding armor plating to protect pilots from defensive fire, building airframes strong enough to survive battle damage that would destroy a Zero. They installed 6 50-caliber machine guns with enough ammunition for sustained combat rather than the brief bursts that earlier fighters allowed, giving Hellcat pilots the firepower to destroy targets quickly without needing perfect positioning. The 2,000 horsepower engine provided speed and climb rate that matched or exceeded the Zeros while carrying all that extra weight, creating a fighter that was heavier and less maneuverable, but faster in a dive, better in a climb, and far more likely to survive combat damage that would kill a Zero. American pilot training evolved alongside the Hellcat to create tactics that exploited these advantages while avoiding Zero strengths. Pilots learned never to dogfight, never to try out-turning a Zero, never to engage on Japanese terms where agility mattered more than speed. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude to build speed that Zeros couldn't match, firing during high-speed passes that didn't give Japanese pilots time to react, then climbing away using engine power the Zero lacked. If a Zero tried following, the Hellcat could outclimb it and set up another attack from a position of advantage. If multiple Zeros attacked, Hellcat pilots supported each other through coordinated tactics that the individualist Japanese approach couldn't counter effectively. This combination of technological superiority and tactical discipline created combat situations where American advantages dominated, while Japanese strengths became irrelevant. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound and demoralizing, as men who'd trained for years to become expert dogfighters found themselves unable to engage American fighters effectively. Imagine being a Zero pilot who'd spent a decade learning aerobatic maneuvers and precision flying, who'd survived 2 years of combat by outmaneuvering opponents, suddenly facing enemies who refused to fight on your terms and destroyed you from angles you couldn't defend against. Hellcat pilots didn't dogfight, didn't give Japanese pilots opportunities to use superior agility, just attacked from above with overwhelming firepower and speed that made evasion impossible before climbing away to safety. This broke the psychological advantage Japanese pilots had enjoyed in early war, turned their confidence into fear, made every engagement a potential death sentence where experience and skill couldn't guarantee survival anymore. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated Hellcat dominance so completely that American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that perfectly captured how one-sided the combat had become. Japanese carriers launched over 300 aircraft in coordinated strikes against American carriers that were protected by hundreds of Hellcats flying combat air patrol at various altitudes, waiting for targets to appear within range. The Japanese formation flew into a meat grinder where American radar directed Hellcats to intercept positions, where coordinated tactics meant every Japanese aircraft faced multiple Hellcats attacking from optimal angles, where technological advantages and superior training combined to create slaughter rather than combat. American pilots destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft while losing just 29 of their own, achieving kill ratios that exceeded 10-1 in a single day's fighting that broke Japanese naval aviation's offensive capability permanently. Individual engagements showed the pattern that repeated throughout the battle as experienced Hellcat pilots exploited every advantage against Japanese formations that were heavy on inexperienced pilots who'd been rushed through training to replace earlier losses. A typical engagement had Hellcats diving from 20,000 feet onto Japanese formations flying at 15,000, building speed to over 400 miles per hour, while Zero pilots watched helplessly as enemies approached from angles they couldn't defend. The Hellcats would fire during high-speed passes that lasted seconds, hitting multiple targets with concentrated machine gun fire before climbing away using engine power that Zeros couldn't match. Japanese pilots trying to counter these attacks found themselves unable to catch diving Hellcats or follow climbing ones, reduced to defensive maneuvers that prolonged survival slightly without creating opportunities to strike back effectively. The ammunition advantage mattered enormously in these engagements because Hellcat pilots could fire longer bursts without worrying about running out, while Zero pilots had to conserve ammunition carefully. 6 50-caliber machine guns with 2,000 rounds total meant Hellcat pilots could fire 400 rounds per gun, enough for sustained combat that could engage multiple targets without ammunition concerns. Compare this to Zero armament that included two 20mm cannon with 60 rounds each, plus 2 rifle-caliber machine guns, giving pilots maybe 10 seconds of cannon fire total before running empty. Hellcat pilots exploited this by forcing Zeros to evade repeatedly, making them burn ammunition on defensive fire, knowing that once cannon rounds depleted, the Zero's offensive capability dropped dramatically. This ammunition advantage, combined with superior firepower, meant Hellcat pilots could destroy targets faster while fighting longer, creating situations where running out of ammunition meant landing to rearm rather than fleeing combat, as Zero pilots often had to do. The armor protection proved its worth in combat when Hellcats returned from missions with damage that would have killed Zeros and their pilots. Battle damage reports documented Hellcats landing aboard carriers with dozens of bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, destroyed instruments, and wounded pilots who survived because armor stopped rounds that would have killed unprotected men. Zero pilots lacked this protection and paid accordingly when return fire or defensive guns scored hits that would have been survivable in armored aircraft. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic fires that consumed Zeros when tracers hit their unprotected fuel, giving Hellcat pilots chances to survive hits that meant certain death in Japanese aircraft. This survivability advantage meant experienced Hellcat pilots accumulated missions and victories, while experienced Zero pilots died steadily from hits that American pilots walked away from after landing damaged aircraft safely. Japanese tactical doctrine couldn't adapt effectively because their entire training system was built around dogfighting skills that were becoming irrelevant in combat against Hellcats. Zero pilots had spent years learning precision aerobatics and expert maneuvering, skills that mattered enormously in turning dogfights, but provided no advantages to enemies who refused to engage in turning combat. The Japanese approach emphasized individual skill and initiative rather than coordinated tactics, worked brilliantly when their aircraft had performance advantages, but fell apart when Americans negated those advantages through better technology and coordinated formations. Japanese pilots found themselves isolated in combat when Hellcats worked in pairs or larger formations, targeted individually by multiple enemies who could support each other, while Japanese formations fragmented into individual dogfights where Americans held every advantage except maneuverability that they weren't using anyway. The training pipeline differences became crucial as combat losses mounted and both sides needed replacement pilots. American training was intensive and lengthy, taking over a year to produce combat-ready pilots who'd accumulated hundreds of flight hours, practicing tactics and gunnery before facing real combat. This investment meant American replacement pilots arrived in theater with skills approaching veteran levels, ready to use Hellcat advantages effectively from their first missions. Japanese training collapsed under pressure to replace losses quickly, reducing flight time and simplifying curriculum until pilots reached combat units with minimal preparation that left them vulnerable to experienced American pilots who'd mastered their aircraft and tactics. This created death spirals where inexperienced Japanese pilots died quickly in their first engagements, forcing even faster training for replacements who were even less prepared and died even faster, ultimately destroying Japanese pilot quality to the point where late-war aviators were effectively sacrificial rather than combat effective. The radar advantage multiplied American effectiveness by allowing controllers to vector Hellcats to optimal intercept positions before Japanese formations even knew they were being engaged. Carrier radar could track incoming raids at hundreds of miles, calculate altitude and heading, direct combat air patrol to climbing intercepts that put Hellcats above and ahead of Japanese formations. This meant American pilots started every engagement with altitude and position advantages that Japanese pilots couldn't counter, attacking from sun positions with speed built up from diving, while Japanese pilots were still climbing or maintaining formation altitude. Zero pilots saw this repeatedly as enemies appeared from optimal angles without warning, attacked with devastating effect, then disappeared before effective counter-tactics could be organized. The technological advantage of radar, combined with radio communications that allowed real-time coordination, created situations where American pilots fought with perfect information while Japanese pilots fought blind. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated all these advantages simultaneously in combat that showcased how completely Hellcat dominated Zero. Over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed versus 29 American losses created 10-to-1 kill ratios in a single engagement, proving the statistics weren't flukes or isolated victories, but represented consistent American superiority across all combat situations. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from this defeat because losing 300 aircraft meant losing 300 pilots in a single day, pilots they couldn't replace with anything approaching equivalent quality. The remaining Japanese carriers limped away from the battle, having failed to damage American carriers significantly, while losing the ability to conduct offensive carrier operations for the rest of the war. This was the death of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force, killed by Hellcat superiority so complete that Japan's best pilots and best tactics couldn't prevent catastrophic defeat. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity when we look at overall Hellcat performance across the entire Pacific War. 5,223 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air combat against 270 Hellcats lost to enemy action gives us that 19-to-1 kill ratio that defined the Pacific Air War from 1943 forward. This wasn't achieved through a few exceptional pilots running up scores against poor opponents. This was consistent performance across thousands of pilots and tens of thousands of combat sorties, where the average engagement favored Hellcats so heavily that Japanese survival became the exception rather than the rule. Every Japanese pilot who encountered Hellcats faced near certain death if they engaged, slightly better odds if they fled, no good options because American fighters were faster and could chase down fleeing Zeros, while fresh Hellcats from carriers could intercept retreat routes. Individual ace pilots demonstrated what skilled aviators could accomplish with Hellcat advantages multiplied by personal ability and combat experience. David McCampbell scored 34 victories to become the Navy's top ace, using Hellcat performance to position himself advantageously and Hellcat firepower to destroy targets efficiently without wasting ammunition or time. His tactics emphasized patience and positioning, waiting for perfect opportunities rather than forcing engagements, using altitude and speed advantages to control when and where combat occurred. Other aces achieved similar results through variations on these themes, all exploiting technological advantages that made expert piloting even more effective while protecting pilots who made mistakes that would have been fatal in lesser aircraft. The Hellcat was forgiving of pilot errors in ways Zero wasn't, allowing Americans to learn from mistakes while Japanese pilots died from theirs. The strategic impact extended beyond air superiority to enable amphibious operations that would have been impossible without Hellcat dominance protecting invasion fleets. Every island assault from late 1943 forward proceeded under Hellcat cover that prevented Japanese air attacks from reaching American ships or beaches, allowing invasions to succeed with casualties from ground combat rather than air attack. The Marines landing at Tarawa and Saipan and Iwo Jima fought under air superiority so complete that Japanese air attacks were rare and ineffective, a dramatic change from early war when Japanese aircraft could attack invasion fleets with relative impunity. This air superiority came from Hellcat capability and pilot training that made American control of the skies inevitable once sufficient numbers deployed to theater, creating conditions where Japan couldn't contest American advances even when they wanted to. Japanese responses to Hellcat's superiority evolved from trying to fight conventionally to desperate measures that reflected their inability to counter American advantages through normal means. They developed the Zero Model 52 with improved engine power and slightly better performance, but these changes couldn't overcome fundamental design limitations that made the Zero fragile and vulnerable to Hellcat firepower. They tried new tactics, emphasizing surprise attacks rather than sustained combat, but American radar negated surprise, while Hellcat performance made disengagement after initial attacks difficult when Americans could pursue effectively. Eventually, Japan resorted to kamikaze tactics, where pilot survival wasn't expected, turning aircraft into guided missiles because they'd concluded that conventional air combat against Hellcats was suicide anyway, so they might as well make that suicide guaranteed to damage American ships. This represents the ultimate admission of defeat, acknowledging that Japanese pilots couldn't win air battles, so they'd skip battles entirely and go straight to crashing into targets. The kamikaze response demonstrates how completely Hellcat had broken Japanese naval aviation by making conventional combat untenable. When your pilots are dying at 19-to-1 rates, when experienced aviators are being replaced by minimally trained teenagers, when every engagement against Hellcats means probable death with minimal chance of destroying enemy aircraft, suicide attacks start looking like rational alternatives. Kamikaze pilots only needed enough training to take off and find American ships, didn't need dogfighting skills or gunnery training, could be produced faster and cheaper than conventional pilots, while potentially achieving better results through guaranteed hits rather than combat kills. This tactical evolution from 1943 through 1945 shows the progression from Japanese confidence to Japanese desperation, from belief they could win through superior pilots and tactics to acceptance that only suicide attacks had any chance of inflicting meaningful damage on American forces. The technological lessons influenced post-war aircraft design worldwide, as every military studied what made Hellcat so effective and incorporated those lessons into future fighters. Pilot protection became mandatory rather than optional. Self-sealing fuel tanks became standard equipment. Armor plating became expected rather than exceptional. Firepower increased with heavier machine guns or cannon becoming universal. Ammunition capacity grew to enable sustained combat, and ruggedness became a design requirement rather than an afterthought. The post-war jet fighters that followed incorporated these lessons while adding jet propulsion and swept wings, but the fundamental philosophy that the Hellcat demonstrated remained unchanged. Design aircraft that protect pilots, provide overwhelming firepower, emphasize technological advantages over dogfighting capability, create fighters that are tools for killing enemies efficiently, rather than platforms for demonstrating pilot skill. The pilot accounts from both sides illuminate how combat felt from individual perspectives beyond statistics and kill ratios. American Hellcat pilots described confidence bordering on arrogance when engaging Zeros, knowing their aircraft was superior and their training was better, understanding that following doctrine meant probable victory, while violating doctrine meant possible defeat. They talked about turkey shoots and easy kills, about Japanese pilots who seemed poorly trained or desperate, about combat that felt less like fighting skilled opponents and more like target practice against enemies who couldn't effectively fight back. This confidence was earned through technological superiority and validated through survival rates that saw most Hellcat pilots complete tours and return home rather than dying in combat like early war pilots had. That survival created expertise that made subsequent tours even more successful, building a pilot corps that dominated Pacific skies through experience, training, and equipment advantages that Japan couldn't match. Japanese Zero pilots described frustration and fear when facing Hellcats, knowing their aircraft's advantages were being negated by American tactics, understanding that engaging meant probable death, while disengaging wasn't always possible. They talked about feeling helpless against enemies who attacked from above with speed they couldn't match, about watching comrades die without being able to help effectively, about surviving through luck rather than skill, because skill didn't matter against technological advantages this large. The late-war Japanese pilots were often teenagers with minimal training, sent against experienced American aces flying superior aircraft, creating matchups that were less combat and more execution. These pilots knew they were probably going to die, wrote last letters before missions, said goodbyes to friends they'd never see again, flew into combat with a resignation that made kamikaze attacks seem rational by comparison. That's what 19-to-1 kill ratios meant in human terms: overwhelming death on one side and overwhelming survival on the other. The production numbers show how America's industrial capacity combined with Hellcat effectiveness to create air superiority through sheer quantity multiplied by quality. Grumman produced over 12,000 Hellcats during the war, flooding the Pacific with aircraft that weren't just numerous, but individually superior to anything Japan fielded. This combination of quantity and quality meant American air groups could absorb losses through replacement aircraft, while Japanese losses were permanent because they couldn't match American production rates. Every Hellcat lost in combat was replaced by two more arriving from factories. Every pilot killed was replaced by trained replacements from extensive training programs, creating American capability that grew throughout the war, while Japanese capability shrank from attrition they couldn't stop or replace effectively. If stories like this matter to you, if understanding how technology wins wars matters, if recognizing the combination of engineering and training that creates dominance matters, subscribe to the Foxhole Chronicles. We tell forgotten stories every week about weapons that changed everything, about pilots who proved their worth in combat, about technological advantages that saved lives and won battles. The Hellcat story is one among many more coming, and we need you with us to keep these memories alive, to honor those who flew and died and survived, to remember that victories come from preparation and capability and courage combined. Subscribe and stay with us through all the stories still to come. The final accounting of the Hellcats' Pacific War record shows why it's considered one of the most successful fighters ever built when we measure success by the mission accomplished rather than raw performance numbers. The 19-to-1 kill ratio represents the highest sustained combat effectiveness of any fighter in any theater of World War II, achieved against frontline opponents flown by professional pilots in combat conditions that tested both aircraft and aviators to their limits. 5,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed meant 5,000 pilots lost, representing destruction of Japan's entire pre-war pilot corps multiple times over through attrition they couldn't replace. The strategic impact of this air superiority enabled every amphibious operation, protected every carrier task force, allowed America to advance across the Pacific with confidence that Japanese air power couldn't stop or even significantly delay American progress toward Japan itself. The comparison to the Zero shows how design philosophy determines combat effectiveness more than raw performance specifications. The Zero was faster initially, more maneuverable always, had longer range throughout, yet lost catastrophically in combat against an aircraft that was heavier, less agile, and required more maintenance. This happened because Grumman designed the Hellcat to win battles rather than win performance contests, prioritized killing enemies over impressing observers, chose pilot survival and combat effectiveness over specifications that looked good on paper. The Zero was optimized for a war where agility mattered most, proved devastatingly effective against opponents who tried to dogfight, then became obsolete when Americans refused to fight on those terms. The Hellcat was optimized for the war Americans actually fought, proved devastatingly effective against opponents who couldn't adapt, remained effective through war's end because its advantages didn't depend on enemies cooperating with American tactics. The legacy continues in modern naval aviation, where the lessons learned from Hellcat's success remain relevant to fighter design and doctrine. Modern fighters are armored, carry extensive electronic countermeasures, prioritize beyond visual range combat, where technological advantages dominate over dogfighting skills. Pilots train extensively before combat deployment, learn coordinated tactics that emphasize mutual support, practice with their aircraft until operation becomes instinctive rather than deliberate. The weapons are different, the speeds are faster, the technology is vastly more sophisticated, but the fundamental approach that the Hellcat pioneered remains unchanged. Build fighters that protect pilots, provide overwhelming advantages, Fight on your terms rather than enemy terms. Train pilots thoroughly rather than rushing them to combat. Replace losses through superior production rather than accepting attrition you can't sustain. These lessons cost Japan 5,000 aircraft, and America proved their validity through 19-to-1 kill ratios that no subsequent conflict has matched. This is the F6F Hellcat, the fighter that destroyed Japanese naval aviation through technological superiority and tactical excellence combined. 19-to-1 kill ratios that shouldn't be possible between professional militaries became reality because American engineers studied every enemy weakness and built a fighter designed to exploit them. 5,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed because American pilots learned tactics that maximize their advantages while neutralizing enemy strengths. The Zero, once the terror of Pacific skies, became target practice for Hellcat pilots who approached combat with confidence earned through survival and validated through victory. This wasn't luck or numerical superiority alone. This was deliberate design and dedicated training, creating capability that dominated combat so completely that Japanese responses evolved from conventional tactics to suicide attacks because nothing else worked against Hellcats flown by properly trained American pilots. The pilots who flew Hellcats in combat deserve recognition for exploiting technological advantages through skill and discipline that made them individually superior to Japanese opponents beyond what their aircraft provided. Flying a superior fighter doesn't guarantee victory if pilots don't use advantages correctly, as early war demonstrated when American pilots tried dogfighting Zeros in aircraft that couldn't match Japanese maneuverability. Hellcat pilots learned from those mistakes, followed doctrine that emphasized boom and zoom tactics, trusted their aircraft's strengths while avoiding situations that highlighted weaknesses. This discipline, combined with extensive training, created aviators who were experts in their aircraft and their tactics before ever seeing combat, ready to execute properly from first missions while surviving to accumulate experience that made them even more dangerous. That combination of preparation and execution created the kill ratios that defined Pacific Air War. The technological advantages that Hellcat demonstrated influenced how America approached military procurement forever after, teaching lessons about investing in quality and preparation rather than rushing inferior equipment to combat. Better to delay deployment while perfecting designs than field aircraft that lose combat at unsustainable rates. Better to train pilots thoroughly than rush poorly prepared aviators to early deaths. Better to accept higher costs for superior capability than save money on equipment that gets users killed. These lessons seem obvious in retrospect, but were revolutionary in early 1940s when conventional wisdom emphasized quantity over quality. Hellcat proved quality matters more than numbers when the quality difference is large enough. The technological superiority can overcome numerical disadvantages. That proper preparation and equipment can achieve kill ratios that make victory inevitable, regardless of enemy determination or courage. Japan lost the Pacific Air War not because their pilots lacked bravery, but because American pilots had better aircraft and better training that made bravery insufficient for survival. The human cost of 19-to-1 kill ratios was 5,000 Japanese families receiving notifications that their sons or fathers or brothers had died in combat, compared to 270 American families receiving similar news about Hellcat pilots. That disparity in grief, in loss, in permanent absence represents the strategic and human impact of technological superiority in warfare. American families got their pilots back after combat tours, while Japanese families mourned losses that accumulated until late war, when experienced pilots were all dead and replacements died in their first missions. This created multi-generational impacts where American veterans came home and had children and lived full lives, while Japanese families had empty places at tables that would never be filled. The statistics of combat are also the statistics of grief, and 19-1 means 19 times as much Japanese loss as American loss, 19 times as many widows and orphans, 19 times as much permanent absence and unending grief. This is the final truth of the F6F Hellcat versus Zero rivalry that defined Pacific air combat from 1943 through 1945. American engineers looked at the Zero problem and solved it through superior design that prioritized protection and firepower over maneuverability, created a fighter optimized for winning battles rather than impressing observers with aerobatic capability. American trainers looked at early war failures and fixed them through extensive pilot preparation that created aviators who understood their aircraft and their tactics before facing combat. American industry looked at combat losses and replaced them faster than Japan could inflict them, maintaining pilot quality through extensive reserves, while Japanese quality collapsed from irreplaceable losses. All of this combined to create 19-1 kill ratios that represented total dominance, that broke Japanese naval aviation permanently, that proved technology and training and industrial capacity determine war outcomes more than courage or determination or willingness to die. The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War through advantages so overwhelming that Japanese responses evolved from conventional combat to kamikaze attacks because nothing else worked against an enemy that was simply better in every measurable way.